On a mission to kill boring presentations. That is the headline of my LinkedIn profile. And I've been at it for almost a decade now. So a large part of what I do includes corporate storytelling, where we inject drama and emotion where none exists, but not with the intent to entertain, with the intent to clarify. So common sense suggests I should be talking about storytelling. That, of course, is a story for another day. What I aspire in the next few minutes is to really dissect and see, is the strength of common sense common? And what is common sense? So let's get right at it. Imagine you are confronted by a large army, a well-equipped and a well-trained army, a well-oiled machinery. However, you also have a thoroughly competent gentleman at the helm of affairs when it comes to running your own army. What do? Common sense dictates that you would attack at a time and place where your enemy least expects it. But what did you do? You laid down all your arms and introduced to the world a word that was never in their vocabulary, ahimsa. You staged a spectacle for the world to see, and you won the war with far fewer casualties and a lot less bloodshed. And you know who I'm talking about, Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi brought us independence by defeating and assaulting what common sense suggested. But then you could say, that's geopolitics and that's the independence, it's a political movement, there's no space for common sense there. Obviously, he didn't use it. I agree. But what about smoking? Common sense dictates we shouldn't have smokers in society. We all know how harmful it is. But we know that anecdotally, the number of smokers is declined year on year. Is that really happening? Data suggests otherwise. World Health Organization studies indicate that India has 120 million smokers as of date. That's about 12% of the global population. What was the number 5 years ago? 112 million. We've seen an increase of 8 million smokers over the last 5 years. The anecdotal evidence suggests otherwise. Common sense dictates otherwise. But then again, the argument that you hear, it's about addiction, it's about peer pressure, no problem. Let's come to something really commonsensical. How many of you are guilty of having broken a New Year's resolution far sooner than you expected to? It could be about eating healthy or running more or losing a little bit of weight. All those guilty, please raise your hands. There you go. Common sense doesn't work at all. But I have a story that really epitomizes that how common sense fails at every step. And our story begins in the 1700s. Around the 1770s, at the peak of Scottish Enlightenment in Edinburgh, two friends got together. A gentleman by the name of Colin MacFarquhar with his dear friend Andrew Bell. They had this huge, lofty ambition to document the entire knowledge that the world had ever generated. They toiled, and with the help of a third person who they hired to be their editor, William Smellie, in 1778, they finally were able to publish the first part of a 3-volume set. The name, Encyclopedia Britannica. For 200 years, the business thrived, the knowledge continued to accumulate, the size in terms of the number of volumes in the set also continued to balloon. And by 1990, the Encyclopedia Britannica was at the peak of sales. They were clocking $650 million in sales in 1990. An army of salespeople knocking door to door, peddling knowledge, and of course, a sense of pride on the bookshelf. But around the same time, there were some tremors happening in the technology domain. And in 1992, a not so old technology firm approached Britannica. And they said, we've got this amazing technology. Can you allow us access to your content? So we'll put it all on the CD and start to distribute the content digitally. The company, Microsoft. Common sense dictated that computers were the future. Britannica should have signed up. What did they do? They refused. And Microsoft being Microsoft, Microsoft continued to hunt and finally got into a non-exclusive contract with a not so credible encyclopedia publisher called Funk and Wagnalls, and hired an advertising agency to give them a nicely coined name, Encarta. And in 1992, the Encarta was born. And they did exactly what Britannica had done in the last 200 years. They extended the brand to include dictionaries and atlases and thesauruses and a whole host of other publications. That was almost like a blow at the very foundation of Encyclopedia Britannica. By 1995, within 3 years of the launch of Encarta, sales of Britannica were plummeting. So much so that it was on the block, available for sale, and the company, I mean. And who did the investment bankers go to? The obvious choice was Microsoft. Again, common sense dictates Microsoft should have lapped up. Why? Because the sale price of the Britannica was half the book value. They refused. Common sense dictates some other publisher should have taken over. But it finally landed in the lap after 18 months of investment bankers running around the globe to find a suitable match. It landed in the lap of billionaire Jacob Safra, somebody we'd never even heard of outside the circles of film financing. Jacob Safra, before that, was known to finance Woody Allen films. He continues to own Encarta to this day. But our story doesn't end here. Fast forward to 2009, and Microsoft released an almost missable press release on their website announcing the demise of Encarta. Robert McHenry, ironically writing on the Britannica blog, wrote a scathing obituary for Encarta, and I quote, "Encarta was never anything to Microsoft but a tool. It turns out to be one that they did not need anymore, and therefore they buried it." But the unthinkable happened a few years later. In 2012, after 244 years of uninterrupted publishing, Britannica announced that it was no more going to be printing the Britannica. The Britannica was going out of print. And common sense suggests the biggest competitor was buried. Why would you want to do that? But whispers and analysts said something strikingly different. It wasn't Encarta that was responsible for the demise of Britannica. It was people like you and me. Not that we'd given up reading, but we'd actually taken up writing. A army of freelance and hobbyists were writing day in and day out on a property that later became the Wikipedia. And we now know that the Wikipedia is also struggling. At every step in this story, you see that common sense has failed us. So it turns out, to figure out whether or not there is strength in common sense, we have to figure out what really is common sense. And we did not have a standard definition of common sense till the year 1984. In the March edition of the American Psychologist, a certain bunch of researchers tried to standardize the definition of common sense. And they wrote, and I quote, "As a starting point, common sense might be defined as a set of cultural groups, body of shared beliefs about the world. That's a bit of a mouthful for something that's as common as common sense. They further go on in that paper to trisect the definition of common sense into three things. The first is it's a set of shared assumptions. Second, it's a set of shared cultural maxims and shared beliefs. And third, it's a shared way of thinking. Now, when we try and look at common sense through this lens, what becomes really clear is that common sense here is not about commonly spread and widely diffused in society. It's about doing common and routine things. That's why it talks of shared assumptions, shared cultural maxims, and shared beliefs around the world. And the world, in the construct of the paper, is how you look at the social and the physical world. So, really, common sense is about common things. It's about how you behave when you're waiting for the metro to come. It's how you stand in queue to buy a ticket for the next movie. And of course, it's how you behave with your mobile phone when you're inside that movie theater. It's not about taking complex, convoluted, and really complicated decisions. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the strength of common sense. Common sense dictates that don't fall into the trap of common sense when you have to take really complex decisions. Use the scientific way. And turns out that science at a point in time was defined as structured common sense. But then, for every rule in science, there is an exception. Red blood cells are supposed to carry oxygen in the body. In the camel, not so. The women of the species bear the offspring. For the seahorse, not so. Entities can be at one place at the same time. For electrons, not so. So really, common sense is defeated by science at every step. And that, I repeat, is the strength of common sense. Don't fall prey to common sense commonly. Thank you.